My name is Melissa Ward. I am 34 years old. And on a Monday morning in October, I was standing in the scrub bay of Hartford General Hospital at 5:47 in the morning, preparing for a 7-hour spinal reconstruction, when my phone buzzed on the shelf beside the sink with a number I recognized immediately. The area code was mine. The prefix was my grandfather's old medical building on Clemson Avenue in Whitfield, Connecticut. The number had not been active in 2 years. I dried my hands. I picked up the phone. The man on the other end introduced himself as Warren Aldis, attorney of Aldis and Burke in Whitfield. He said, "Dr. Ward, I apologize for the early hour. I've been trying to reach you for the better part of a week on a matter involving your grandfather's estate and certain documents he placed in my care 4 years ago." I said, "What kind of documents?" He said, "The kind that should have been presented to your family at the time of your grandfather's passing and were not. The kind that changed the disposition of a property that has since been transferred and operated in a manner that violates the original conditions your grandfather placed on it." I looked at the scrub sink, at the clock above the door, at the institutional lighting I have moved through every morning for 7 years. I said, "I have surgery in 11 minutes. He said, "I know, Dr. Ward. I called the hospital twice last week. I'll wait as long as I need to." I said, "I'll call you this afternoon." He said, "I'll be here." I set the phone down. I finished scrubbing. I walked through the double doors into the OR, and I did not think about Warren Aldis or the documents or my grandfather's building on Clemson Avenue for the next 7 hours, because the patient on the table was 61 years old and had been waiting 11 months for the surgery and deserved every cell of my attention. That is the first thing I learned from my grandfather. The patient is the room. Everything else is the hallway. He said it to me when I was 8 years old, sitting in his office on Clemson Avenue on a summer Wednesday, watching him review charts before his afternoon appointments with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood that medicine was not a job but a relationship, and that relationships required your whole self or they required nothing. His name was Dr. Henry Ward. He practiced family medicine in Whitfield, Connecticut for 37 years. He delivered 912 babies, which I know because he kept a ledger of them, leather-bound, updated in his small, precise handwriting until the year he retired, and I found it on the shelf above his desk when I was 14 and asked him about it. And he said every one of them was somebody's whole world arriving. He was the kind of doctor who still made house calls in 2008. He was the kind of doctor who knew his patients' children's names and their parents' histories, and the particular way certain families held their grief, and the particular way other families held their joy. He understood that treating a person meant treating the story they carried, not just the body that carried it. He gave me a stethoscope when I was accepted to Yale School of Medicine. A Littman Cardiology 3, which he had been using since 1984, worn smooth on the diaphragm and warm to the touch from 37 years against his coat. He pressed it into my hands in his office on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "I have been waiting to give you this since you were 11 years old, and you told me you were going to be a surgeon." I said, "How did you know I'd actually do it?" He said, "Because you said it the same way you say everything that's true." Without looking for my reaction first, I have kept that stethoscope in the top left drawer of my desk since the day he gave it to me. I do not use it in the OR because the OR has its own instruments. But I have held it on the nights that were hard, and there have been nights that were hard, and it has been enough. My grandfather died in the fall of 2019. He was 81 years old. He died at home, in the house on Whitfield Road where he had lived for 50 years, in the chair by the window that looked out over the maple tree he had planted the year my father was born. His nurse Margaret was with him. She called me first, before anyone else in the family, because he had asked her to. I drove to Whitfield that night. I sat in the chair beside his for a long time. Then I called my father. That is its own story. But first I need to tell you who my father is. Gordon Ward is 64 years old. He is my grandfather's son in the biological sense, and in that sense only, because the qualities my grandfather carried, the patience, the precision, the understanding that people deserve your full attention, did not transfer in the way genetics transfers other things. My father worked in commercial real estate for 31 years. He is good at it. He is the kind of man who reads a room and adjusts accordingly, who tells people what they want to hear with enough conviction that they believe he has thought about it, and who has spent 64 years operating on the understanding that the world is arranged around certain hierarchies, and that the correct approach to life is to know your place in them and maintain it. In my father's hierarchy, sons run things and daughters support the people who run things. This is not a stated philosophy. He has never said this sentence out loud, but it is the architecture of every decision he has made in my lifetime, and I know it the way you know architecture, not because someone explained it to you, but because you have been moving through it your whole life and you know which doors open and which ones don't. My brother Daniel is 31 years old. He is 3 years younger than me. He has my father's ease and my mother's warmth and the particular charm of a man who has never been told that his charm has limits. He did not go to medical school. He studied business administration for 2 years at a state school in Vermont, left without completing his degree, returned to Whitfield at 22, and has been operating in the comfortable orbit of my parents' expectations ever since. My mother Patricia is 62 years old. She is the kind of woman who measures love in appearances, not cruelly. She is not a cruel person. She is a person who is raised to believe that the most important thing you can do for the people you love is to make sure they look all right, and she has applied this principle uniformly and consistently across every relationship in her life. My mother introduced me at family gatherings as our daughter Melissa, who is a doctor somewhere up north, with a particular emphasis on somewhere and a particular gloss on doctor that made it sound like something I had picked up on a whim rather than something I had trained for over a decade. She was not embarrassed of me. I want to be clear about that. She was proud of me in the abstract, the way people are proud of things they don't fully understand, with warmth and without specificity. She simply did not understand what I did. She had never asked. And I had stopped explaining around 2014, which was the year I defended my surgical residency evaluation and called home to share the result, and my mother said, "That's wonderful, Melissa. Your cousin Susan just got engaged. Isn't that something?" And I understood, with the clean, painless clarity that comes from finally having proof of what you already knew, that the accounting in this family did not include line items for the things I was building. I kept building anyway. Because the work is what you do regardless of whether anyone is watching. My grandfather taught me that too. Let me tell you about the building on Clemson Avenue. My grandfather opened his practice there in 1973. He had been practicing out of a shared space for 4 years before that, saving what he could, and when the building came available, a 2-story colonial with a waiting room that got afternoon light and an examination suite that could accommodate 4 patients at once. He bought it with the money he had saved and a loan from my great-grandmother that he repaid in full within 3 years. He spent the next 37 years building a practice in that building that the town of Whitfield depended on in the specific way that small towns depend on family doctors, not just for medicine, but for continuity, for someone who knew the whole story, for a presence in the community that was steady regardless of what else shifted. I spent 12 summers in that building. I filed charts. I answered phones. I learned the names of the regular patients and the nature of their conditions and the particular things that mattered to each of them. Mr. Halvorsen, who had been coming in for his blood pressure since 1982 and who always brought a newspaper clipping about something that had caught his attention. Mrs. Delacroix, who had lost her husband the previous year and who came in every 6 weeks not entirely because of her arthritis. The Kowalski family, all 7 of them, who had been my grandfather's patients since before the parents were born and who called him Doc Henry with a familiarity that was not informality but intimacy. I learned from being in that building for 12 summers that medicine was not what I had thought it was before I started. I had thought it was the science. The science is important. The science is necessary. But the science is the floor. What goes on top of the floor is the relationship, and the relationship requires everything the science does not: patience, attention, memory, the willingness to sit with someone in the hard parts of their experience without trying to fix the unfixable, the ability to say "I don't know" and mean it and have it land as honesty rather than failure. My grandfather embodied all of it. He was the reason I became a surgeon. not because he was a surgeon. He was a family physician, and the clinical paths could not be more different, but because he showed me what it looked like to be in medicine with your whole self. What it looked like to walk into a room and have the patient feel that something had shifted simply because you had arrived. That the room had gotten better. I wanted to make rooms better. I have spent 14 years trying to do exactly that. My grandfather retired in 2016. He was 78 years old. His hands had developed a tremor the previous year that made examinations more difficult, and his instinct told him that the year the hands begin to fail is the year you step back, and his instinct was never wrong about these things. He retained ownership of the building. He closed the practice. He began the process of estate planning with a focus and precision that, I would learn 3 years later, went considerably further than anyone in my family had understood. He called me in August of 2016 to tell me he was retiring. He called me first, before my father, before Daniel, before anyone. He said, I want you to know before I tell the rest of them. This is your information first. I said, why? He said, because the building is going to become a question. And I want you to hear my answer before you hear anyone else's version of it. He said, I want the practice to continue. Not necessarily my practice. I understand medicine changes. But I want that building to be used for medicine, by someone in this family who earned the right to practice it. I have spoken to Warren about how to make that happen. I said, Warren? He said, Warren Aldis. My attorney. He's been my attorney for 22 years. He's a good man. He's very precise. I said, what is he going to do? He said, what I asked him to do. What I should have set up years ago. I'm correcting an oversight. I said, what oversight? He said, the one where I assumed your father understood what I intended and didn't put it in writing. He said it quietly. The way he said things that were corrections of himself, with the directness of a man who did not believe in softening his own errors. I said, Dad wants to give the building to Daniel. He said, your father wants a great many things. What he gets from me is determined by what I put in writing. I should have put this in writing in 2002. I'm putting it in writing now. He said, I wanted you to know, Melissa. So that when the time comes, you know. I said, what do I know? He said, that I see what you've built. That I have always seen it. And that I am building something on my end that reflects what I see. He did not say anything else directly. He did not need to. I have spent my life learning to listen to my grandfather's silences as carefully as his words. 3 months after that phone call, my grandfather met with Warren Aldis and restructured his estate documents. I know this because Warren told me 3 years later, in his office in Whitfield on a Monday afternoon. My grandfather did not tell me what he had done. Not specifically. He knew my father. He knew that if I knew the specifics, I would feel an obligation to say something, and if I said something, my father would begin working to undo it, and my grandfather wanted it to be undone proof before anyone knew to try. So he told me he was correcting an oversight. And he told Warren exactly what to do. And he asked Warren to hold the relevant documents until after the estate was settled and the building had transferred and the condition had been in place long enough to be tested. That is what Warren meant when he said, the kind of documents that should have been presented 4 years ago and weren't. But before I get to Warren's office, I need to tell you about my father and Daniel and the 2 years between my grandfather's retirement and his death, because what happened in those 2 years is what my grandfather was preparing for the entire time. My grandfather retired in 2016. He died in 2019. In the 3 years between, the question of the building on Clemson Avenue became the organizing principle of every family gathering I attended. Not because my father raised it directly. He never raised things directly. My father does not do things directly. What he does is suggest and imply and position, and he does it with the ease of a man who has spent 31 years in commercial real estate and understands that the most effective way to move a person in a direction is to make them believe they arrived there themselves. He began working on my grandfather in 2017. I know this because my grandfather called me after Thanksgiving that year and said, "Your father came to see me on Wednesday. He wants to talk about Daniel taking over the building." I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I told him the building had conditions on it that Daniel wouldn't meet." I said, "What did Dad say?" He said Daniel could hire the right people. I told him the conditions were not about hiring. They were about qualification. And then I told him I was tired and it was late and he should drive safely. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't worry about it, Melissa. It's in writing." I said, "What's in writing?" He said, "Everything that needs to be." And then he changed the subject to the maple tree outside his window, which had turned an exceptional color that year and which he wanted me to come see before the leaves dropped. I drove to Whitfield that weekend. The maple was extraordinary. We sat by the window and watched it without saying anything for a long time. That was the last time I sat with my grandfather in his house with the leaves on. He died in October of 2019. The memorial service was attended by 311 people. I counted. 311 people came to Whitfield Methodist Church on a Tuesday morning in October to say goodbye to Dr. Henry Ward. The minister read a letter that Margaret Holt had written on behalf of the nursing staff. 4 of his former patients spoke. The room was full of the specific warmth of people who have lost someone who made their lives better simply by being in them. My father gave the family eulogy. He spoke about the practice and the building and the legacy, and at a certain point he looked at Daniel, who was sitting in the second row, and said, "Now it falls to the next generation to carry what Henry built. And I know Daniel is ready for that responsibility." I was sitting in the 4th row. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his hands. Margaret Holt, sitting 3 seats to my left, looked at me. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the front of the church and pressed her lips together in the way she had pressed them in my grandfather's waiting room for 31 years when a patient said something she disagreed with, but that was not her place to correct. Margaret knew something. I understood that in the moment. I did not know what it was yet. The estate settled in the spring of 2020. My grandfather's house went to my father, as expected. The investment accounts were distributed according to the will's terms, which were precise and fair and caused no significant dispute. The personal effects were divided by family agreement. The building on Clemson Avenue was transferred to my father, as executor, with the instruction to use it for the continuation of a family medical practice. My father interpreted this as an instruction to hand it to Daniel. Daniel opened a wellness center. Not a medical clinic. Not a family practice. Not anything that required a medical license or clinical training or the oversight of a licensed physician. A wellness center. Nutritional consultations. A visiting acupuncturist on Thursdays. Something called integrative health coaching that Daniel had read about in a business magazine and decided was the future of health. My father said, "Henry would have wanted the building to serve the community. This serves the community." I said, "Dad, the instruction was to use it for a medical practice." He said, "Medicine is changing, Melissa." Henry understood that. Daniel is evolving with it. I said, "Daniel doesn't have a medical license." He said, "He doesn't need one for what he's doing." I said, "What he's doing isn't medicine." My father looked at me with the expression he wears when I have said something that inconveniences an arrangement he has already finalized. He said, "You don't have to be involved, Melissa. We know you're busy up there." Up there. Hartford. 90 minutes from Whitfield. Up there. I said, "Okay, Dad." I drove home. I called Margaret Holt. She didn't answer. She called me back 3 days later and said, "I've been expecting your call. Let me tell you what I know. But before I go further, welcome to Velvet Revenge Stories. This channel is for women who are told, in ways that were never quite said out loud, that the building was for someone else. That the inheritance was for the child who needed it, not the child who earned it. That being capable was its own reward and required no further acknowledgement. If someone once handed the foundation to someone else and told you it was evolution, this one is for you. Drop a comment below. Subscribe. And stay with me. Because Warren Aldis had been holding a document for 4 years. And what my grandfather put in writing is the most precise thing that has ever been said about the Ward family and the question of who earned what. Margaret Holt worked for my grandfather for 31 years. She started as a receptionist, became a medical assistant, became over 3 decades the kind of person who understands a practice the way the person who built it understands it, Not just the clinical operations, but the architecture of it, the intention behind the decisions, the philosophy that made it what it was. My grandfather trusted her completely. He had trusted her with the filing systems and the patient records and the after-hours protocols and, in the years when his memory began to move more slowly, with the calendar and the billing and the specific details that he could no longer hold simultaneously. She was 63 years old in 2020. She had retired when my grandfather retired. She called me back on a Thursday evening in April and said, "Melissa, I need to tell you some things your grandfather asked me to hold on to." I sat down at my kitchen table. She said, "Henry came to me in January of 2017, after your father's Thanksgiving visit. He was very calm about it. The calmest I had ever seen him be about something that was serious. He gave me a folder. He said, 'Margaret, keep this somewhere safe. When the time comes, and I think you'll know when the time comes, give it to Melissa.'" I said, "What was in the folder?" She said, "I didn't open it. He didn't ask me to. He asked me to hold it." I said, "Margaret." She said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. I watched the building transfer, and I watched Daniel open that wellness center, and I told myself it would sort itself out. It hasn't sorted itself out. It's gotten worse." I said, "What do you mean worse?" She said, "There was a woman here last month looking for the doctor's office. She'd gotten a referral somewhere for a procedure. She had paperwork. The paperwork had your grandfather's address on it. But it also had billing codes for clinical procedures. Medical procedures. The kind that require a physician to perform." I said, "What kind of procedures?" She said, "The kind Daniel is not qualified to perform and likely has not performed. The kind that if someone billed for them without performing them constitute fraud." I said, "Margaret." She said, "I know." I said, "Is this what my grandfather was protecting against?" She said, "I think he was protecting against several things. The folder might tell you more than I can." I said, "Can I come get it?" She said, "I was hoping you'd ask." I drove to Whitfield on a Saturday morning. Margaret met me at the door of her house on Sycamore Street in the neat, organized way of a woman who has spent 31 years making sure things were in order and has not stopped simply because the job ended. She made coffee. She placed the folder on the kitchen table between us. She said, "I haven't opened it. I want you to know that." I said, "I know, Margaret." I opened the folder. Inside the folder was a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, which I recognized from 30 years of notes left on my desk during those 12 summers and birthday cards, and a single piece of paper he had pressed into my hand at my medical school graduation that said, "You did it, and I always knew you would." The letter was addressed to me. It said, "Melissa, if Margaret has given you this folder, then something has gone the way I thought it might. I hope I'm wrong. I have often been wrong about my family's capacity to surprise me, and I would very much like this to be one of those times. But I have been around long enough to know that hope and preparation are not the same thing, and a good doctor prepares for the diagnosis she hopes won't come. Let me tell you what is in this folder and why it matters." In November of 2016, after your father came to discuss Daniel and the building, I called Warren Aldis and asked him to make certain additions to the estate documents that I had not previously included. Warren is a careful man. He will have copies of everything. I am giving you duplicates so that the information exists in more than one place. The first document is an amendment to the deed of the Clemson Avenue property. The amendment includes a restrictive covenant added with my knowledge and consent as the property owner before the transfer occurred. The covenant states that the property may only be used for the active practice of medicine by a licensed physician who is a member of the Ward family by blood. If this condition is not met for a period of 18 consecutive months, ownership of the property transfers automatically to the Henry Ward Medical Foundation, which I established for this purpose in February of 2017. I will not pretend I did not know what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was making sure that the building I spent 37 years building a practice in would remain what I built it to be, and that the person most qualified to decide its future would have the standing to do so. The second document is the incorporation papers for the Henry Ward Medical Foundation. The sole administrator, named in the bylaws, is Dr. Melissa N. Ward. That is you. The third document is a letter from my cardiologist dated March of 2017, confirming that I was of full legal and cognitive capacity at the time of the deed amendment. I knew someone would want to see it. He had included the capacity letter because he knew someone would challenge it, because he knew his family, and because he was precise about these things. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it on Margaret's kitchen table. Margaret handed me my coffee mug. I hadn't touched it. I said he did all of this in 2017. She said he was very calm about it. The way he was calm about the things he had decided completely. I said he never told me. She said he told me why. He said if you knew, you would feel responsible for what happened next. He didn't want you to carry it before you had to. He didn't want me to carry it before I had to. 37 years of practicing medicine. Every night sleeping with the weight of the people he had been responsible for that day. The specific gravity of that. And even in his dying years, he was making sure I didn't carry more than necessary. I held the folder. Outside Margaret's kitchen window, the maple trees on Sycamore Street were the same color as the ones outside his window the last October I sat with him. I said, "How long has Daniel been in the building without a physician on staff?" Margaret said, "From the day he opened." 2020. He brought in a visiting naturopath for a while, but that ended in 21. There has been no licensed physician associated with the practice since your grandfather left. I said, "That's more than 18 months. She said, "Significantly more." I said, "I need to call Warren Aldis." She said, "I think he's been waiting for you to." I drove home to Hartford that afternoon with the folder on the passenger seat and my grandfather's letter folded in my coat pocket. I called Warren from Margaret's driveway before I left. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "Dr. Ward, I've been trying to reach you." I said, "I know. I'm sorry. Tell me what you need me to do." He said, "The covenant has been in violation for 31 months. The automatic transfer clause is already active under the terms of the document. What I need from you is your direction on how you'd like to proceed with the foundation." I said, "I'll come to your office Monday." He said, "I'll have everything ready." I arrived at Warren Aldis's office on Asylum Street at 2 in the afternoon on a Monday in October. Warren was 67 years old, white-haired, with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who has spent 4 decades making sure documents said exactly what the client needed them to say, and not one word more or less. He had a folder on the table that was 3 inches thick. He walked me through every document. The deed amendment, dated February of 2017. My grandfather's signature, clear and steady, witnessed by 2 of Warren's colleagues and notarized by the firm's notarial officer. The restrictive covenant in precise legal language that Warren had drafted across 4 revisions with my grandfather over 2 weeks until it said exactly what my grandfather wanted it to say and nothing it didn't. The Foundation Incorporation Papers, filed with the state in February of 2017. Purposes: to support and advance community medicine in the town of Whitfield and surrounding areas, with a preference for maintaining accessible primary care for underserved populations. Administrator: Dr. Melissa N. Ward. The capacity letter from my grandfather's cardiologist. Full legal and cognitive capacity confirmed. Then Warren showed me the violation documentation. 31 months of operating a non-medical wellness center in a property with a medical use restriction. 31 months past the 18-month threshold. The automatic transfer clause had been active for 13 months. I said, "My father doesn't know any of this." Warren said, "Your father was shown the will at the time of the estate settlement and saw the building transferred to him as executor with the instruction to use it for a family medical practice." The deed amendment was properly recorded with the county and is in the public record. He would have known about it if he had reviewed the deed independently before transferring the building to Daniel. I said he didn't review the deed. Warren said, "Most people in his position assume the estate attorney has handled everything correctly and don't review the underlying property documents independently. Your grandfather understood this. He arranged things accordingly." I said, "He arranged things so that a person who didn't do due diligence wouldn't discover the protection until after the violation had occurred." Warren said, "Your grandfather was a very thoughtful man." He paused. He said, "He spoke about you in every meeting we had." Not about your career specifically. About the kind of person you are. He said, she shows up. He said it the way people say things that are the whole of what they mean. I held the folder. I thought about my grandfather saying she shows up to his attorney in a law office in Whitfield, Connecticut, in the same plain language he had used to tell me the patient is the room. I said, what do I need to do? Warren said, you need to notify your father and Daniel that the covenant exists and that the property has transferred to the foundation. I can handle the legal notification formally, which I recommend. What you do personally is up to you. I said, I'd like to tell them myself. Warren said, I thought you might. He said, your grandfather thought so too. He left a note in the file. He handed me a sealed envelope. My name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. I opened it. One line. When you tell them the truth plainly and then stop talking. The truth doesn't need your help. I folded the note. I put it in my coat pocket. I thanked Warren Aldis. I drove to Whitfield on a Saturday in November, and I sat down with my father and my mother and Daniel at the kitchen table in the house on Whitfield Road, where my grandfather had lived for 50 years. I placed the folder on the table. I said, I need to show you something my grandfather arranged. My father looked at the folder. He said, what is this? I said, it's the deed amendment to the Clemson Avenue property. There's a restrictive covenant Granddad added in 2017. It limits the use of the property to an active medical practice run by a licensed physician who is a Ward family member. The covenant includes an automatic transfer clause. If the condition isn't met for 18 months, the property transfers to the Henry Ward Medical Foundation. My father said, that's not what the will says. I said, this isn't the will. This is the deed. They're separate documents. The will gave you the building as executor to use for a family medical practice. The deed tells you what a family medical practice means in this context and what happens if that condition isn't met. Daniel said, this isn't right. I said, the covenant was filed with the county in February of 2017. It's been in the public record for 7 years. My mother said, your grandfather didn't tell us. I said, no, he didn't. He told his attorney and he documented it and he filed it and he trusted that the documentation would do the work when it needed to. My father said, Melissa, this is the family's building. I said, the building belongs to the foundation now, Dad. It has for 13 months. The automatic transfer happened in September of last year. The room was very quiet. My father looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the folder. My mother looked at her hands. I said, there's something else you should know. There's a complaint filed with the Connecticut Department of Public Health about billing irregularities at that address. Claims submitted under provider codes suggesting licensed medical procedures were performed at a building where no licensed physician has practiced since 2020. I wanted you to hear that from me before it becomes something else. Daniel's face had gone the particular color of a person who has understood that a problem they thought was manageable has just become a different kind of problem entirely. My father said, can this be contested? I said, you can consult an attorney. Warren Aldis will tell you what he told me. The document is valid. The capacity is documented. The filing is public record. He said, Melissa. I said, yes. He said, your grandfather did this to your brother. I said, my grandfather did this to protect what he built. Daniel is going to need his own attorney for the billing matter. I'd suggest that's where the focus goes right now. My father looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent a lifetime arranging things and has just found an arrangement he did not make and cannot undo. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform the moment. I did not add a single word past what needed to be said. I placed the folder on the table. I said what needed to be said. And then I stopped talking. Because the truth doesn't need your help. My grandfather told me that. On a sealed note in a law office in Whitfield. After 37 years of practicing it, the billing complaint took 11 months to resolve. Daniel retained an attorney. The matter was settled with the Department of Public Health. I will not tell you the terms because they are not mine to tell. What I will tell you is that the building on Clemson Avenue is no longer operating as a wellness center, and that the Henry Ward Medical Foundation is currently in the process of establishing a partnership with a regional primary care group to reopen it as a community clinic focused on underserved families in the Whitfield area. The clinic is expected to open in the spring. It will have a plaque in the waiting room. I helped Warren choose the language. It will say, "This building was established for the practice of medicine in 1973 by Dr. Henry Ward. It returns to that purpose in his memory, by his design, and with the gratitude of everyone who received his care." Margaret Holt has agreed to volunteer one morning a week at the front desk when the clinic opens. She said, "I've been retired for 7 years. I think I can manage a Tuesday." I said, "I think so too." She said, "Your grandfather would have liked this, Melissa." I said, "I think he planned for it." She said, "I think he planned for a lot of things. My father and I have spoken 4 times since the Saturday in November. The conversations have been careful and brief, and they've contained more honesty than most of the conversations we had in the previous 34 years, which is something I did not expect and which I am still deciding what to do with." At Christmas, my father said, "Henry never told me he had done all of this." I said, "No, he didn't." My father said, "He trusted you with it instead." I said, "He trusted Warren with the documents. He trusted Margaret with the folder. He trusted me with the outcome." My father said, "That's the same thing." I said, "It's not, Dad. He trusted a lot of people with different parts of it. The part he trusted me with was the part that required showing up." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've always been good at that." I said, "Yes, I have." He looked at his plate. He said, "I know we haven't always made it easy." I said, "No, you haven't." He said, "I'm sorry for that, Melissa." I held that. The way you hold something when you have been waiting to hear it for so long that when it arrives you're not entirely sure it's real. I said, "I know, Dad." And I meant it. Not as forgiveness. Not as resolution. As acknowledgement. He had said it. He had meant it. That is somewhere you can work from. Like they always say, the people who hand the building to someone else always forget to read the foundation. My grandfather built a foundation in 2017 that my father didn't know to look for. He built it the way he built everything in his life, precisely, patiently, without announcing it. He documented it and filed it and trusted that the documentation would do what documentation does when it is handled correctly. It speaks. Without being raised. Without being performed. Without needing anyone to point at it and say, "Look." It simply speaks. And when it speaks, the room understands something it will not be able to unsay. My name is Melissa Ward. I am 34 years old. I am a trauma surgeon at Hartford General Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. I keep my grandfather's Littman Cardiology 3 stethoscope in the top left drawer of my desk. I keep his note in my coat pocket. Tell them the truth plainly and then stop talking. The truth doesn't need your help. I have read it on the days that were hard. There have been days that were hard. It has been enough. The clinic opens in the spring. The plaque will be in the waiting room. My grandfather's name will be on it. Mine will be on the administrator's door. That is how he wanted it. He told Warren. He put it in writing. And Warren kept his word for 4 years. That is my story. One building. One restrictive covenant. One attorney who kept his word. And one very precise, very patient man who understood that the truth does not need your help. It simply needs to be documented and filed and left in the right hands until the moment it is needed. If this reminded you that the foundation matters more than the building, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Hit subscribe. And I will see you in the next one.